So for those of you online and everybody who's here in the room, welcome to our Science Education Department March seminar with Remy Dou, who's come all the way up from Florida International. And just a couple of ground rules. I want to thank, not ground rules, but acknowledgements. I want to thank Ting Reed and Shu Wu for assisting with seminar, and the three of us make up the co-chairs for seminar. And we invite people to check out our website with the video recordings, and that is posted in the chat. And if you're interested in being on our mailing list for next seminars, please feel free to put your email in the chat as well. Wendy Berwin will add you to the list. So we ask people to, if you can, leave your cameras on so that our speaker can see that we have real life people and talking to people, but also feel free to put questions in the chat or use the raise hand feature and we can take questions as we go along. So I will introduce our department director, Phil Sadler, to further introduce our.
Is there a camera up front there?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, so I can sit here or can go?
You probably could sit here. You can sit here.
Good right there.
So I want to welcome everyone here in person and online. This seminar series takes place monthly where we bring in current researchers in STEM education. And my pleasure today is to introduce Dr. Remy Dou. He's an associate professor at Florida International University, one of the largest Hispanic serving institutions in the US. Now, he started his career as a biology teacher. So he's actually been in the trenches, knows what the issues are in the classroom and in the nation's schools. He has a PhD in curriculum and instruction, specializing in physics, education research, and educational statistics. In 2019, he was awarded an NSF career grant, which is a very prestigious faculty early career development grant. So now he has, as an associate professor, he has dual appointments in the Department of Teaching and Learning and in the STEM Transformation Institute at FIU. Now, Remy's research focuses on STEM identity development, how people start to think of themselves as science, technology, engineering, and mathematical people. Especially that which occurs in out of school time settings like homes or zoos or parks. I guess a home could be a zoo. Mine certainly was. I think his most interesting work focuses on how family science conversations shape youth and families' affinity with STEM fields. That science, talking about science is really important. And we have a project now that's looking at the development of science teachers. And it comes up again in that context, that talking about science when you don't have to talk about it, but being interested in science enough to talk about scientific topics is a predictor of STEM identity. It's also a predictor of science teacher identity. His studies highlight diverse voices and cultures of the Latino communities. And he has a commitment to this construction of equitable and transformative STEM spaces. So and Remy does exceptional work, and I would be in envy of him, except that there's a piece of ancient wisdom that says a person may become envious of anyone else except his child or his student. So Remy is my postdoc. So he's my academic grandchild. So I can't be envious of him at all. I can just be admiring him.
In awe.
In awe. In awe. Okay.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. I almost want to stay seated, but well,
Sure.
yeah.
No, it's okay. If you want to stand.
All right. I'll stand, and then if I get tired, this owl's really cool.
Yeah, the owl practice.
Yeah, very awesome. So if I get tired and I sit down, I might actually do that.
We'll lay down on the couch.
That's awesome. Phil, that was such a nice introduction. And thank you everybody for having me. Cynthia for inviting me. That was so nice of you. It's really cool to see all of you in person, face to face, and behind the screen. As Phil was saying, I am an academic grandchild from this group. It's been, I want to say 6 or 7 years since I started working with you all, and it started thanks to Zara, who's just phenomenal. And she invited me to do an analysis of the Frost data set. So if you remember working on that large scale survey administration, and we did an analysis and we included this little variable asking families or asking college students to report whether or not they spoke to their family members about science as children. And we saw this very interesting relationship between that variable and STEM identity and how college students were seeing themselves in relation to STEM. That inspired my career proposal, again, with Zara's support, refining what that sounded like and looked like, which was awarded. And that led to the team that I currently have, which is an amazing team, and all the work really that I do revolves around that one kind of really cool correlation that we saw there. And exploring and diving deep into what that means and what that looks like, especially in home settings. Before I really get into it, I have to share something, because when I travel, let me see this, work, hopefully it'll work. Whenever I travel outside of Miami and I tell people that I am from Miami, they're like, oh, and I see these raised eyebrows of like, oh, you're from Miami. And I wonder what they're imagining, you know, my campus looks like. And it doesn't have sandy beaches, and students are not typically in bathing suits. Most people, right? It's a pretty normal college campus. It's a commuter school. Most students live in the area. And what you see on TV, whenever you're watching TV and there's a scene that happens in Miami, it's about 20 to 30 minutes away, assuming that there's no traffic. There's always traffic in Miami. And a lot of people come down to Miami because we've got the beautiful skylines and boating and beaches and all sorts of cool things. And so FIU is all the way on the other side. I've lived in Miami since I was 6 or 7 years old. And I now develop a sense of, because we do have a lot of like New Englanders moving down to Miami. And so now I know how to tell the difference between somebody from Miami, somebody who's not from Miami. The caveat is that they have to be wearing a button-down long sleeve shirt. But if they are, then the key is to look for the Miami button. And if you know Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who played football at the University of Miami and claim him as our own, that's right, yeah. He's displaying his Miami button proudly. And so that Miami button is that one button that probably should be buttoned up, but isn't. That's the Miami button. And I tried to kind of rock my Miami button, but it's really cold. So if you see me kind of like tying it up, there's a reason for that. Part of why I show this, and I do think it's hilarious. By the way, I can dress up nice. I do like tie my buttons up for pictures and things like that. Part of why I share this is because I do think that it's related to how we begin to think about groups of people and how we come up with notions and archetypes of individuals and how we begin to relate ourselves to those archetypes in order to inform our own identities and who we are. So yes, being from Miami there is an archetype of what it means to be from Miami. In some ways, I mirror that archetype, and in some ways I don't. But prior to doing this research, I had worked as an education fellow at the National Science Foundation, and I got this really cool opportunity to work with Carl Wyman at the Office of Science and Technology and Policy on the 5-year federal STEM education strategic plan. The very first one that they came out with, I think they're on version 2 or 3 at this point. And at the time I had been asked to work on this project to think about how do we diversify student engagement in federal education programs, STEM education programs. And part of the reason why they invited me was because of my experience having taught in a city as diverse as Miami. For about 8 years, I taught life science, as Phil mentioned, but also my own experiences that I bring with me, wherever I go, whether it's teaching in the classroom or whether it's research, I do consider myself an English language learner to this day. Phil and Gerhard and I were having an interesting conversation about how self-conscious I get about my accent, or at least I had mentioned that. And they were saying, no, we don't hear an accent. And it was very encouraging, but also I am highly aware of that and try not to be. And part of that is that I didn't speak English when I came here. I remember this this one, I couldn't forget this. So I'm here, I'm like 6.5 years old. I get placed in it was second grade classroom or third grade classroom. I can't remember. But there was this boy who sat in front of me every single day. This boy would turn around and smile, this big smile, and say stuff and laugh. And I didn't know what he was saying. And so if he smiled, I just smiled back. And if he laughed, I would just laugh back. And he seemed like we had these long conversations, apparently, for the rest of the year. And we had no idea what the other was saying. And I'll never forget that. But eventually I did figure out how to communicate. But I love the fact that I had some of those experiences, because then I can connect with the participants that are involved in our studies, many of whom are from South Florida. And I also, this is something that I think my entire team will really embrace the diversity of religions, of beliefs, of philosophies, of cultural backgrounds and immigration histories. We embrace that. We don't shy away from that. We draw on those perspectives and lenses when we're interpreting our data and we're thinking about what our data is saying. We're looking for places where we find overlap. We're checking each other's biases and assumptions because we're able to lean on our experiences, on our languages, on our perspectives. And so this is just a little ode to the awesome team of people I get to work on a weekly basis. Part of the reason why there's been this huge increase in the number of scholars that are exploring STEM identity is this relationship that we seem to find, regardless of whether we're exploring the concept in chemistry or computer science, or whatever STEM discipline, is this correlation between seeing yourself as a STEM person. Here, these are graphs of college students who have been invited to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 5, how much of a STEM person, to what extent they see themselves as a STEM person. And then we'd also ask them to give us, tell us what majors, what careers are they aspiring to, or are they pursuing. And we break it down by biological sciences, chemistry, and then also we kind of group them all up into STEM major. And so the pattern is generally the same. You see this very strong connection between these two things, between our career choices or intentions and our STEM identity. But we also see some, what I think are interesting nuances. If you look at biological sciences, the scale runs from 1 to 5. So if you look at 3 at the midpoint, you're like, yeah, I sort of see myself as STEM person, not super strongly, but yeah, sort of. You're here at that 3, and you have approximately 65% probability of aspiring to a degree in biological sciences with some margin of error. And then I'll look at the chemistry, because it's the extreme case. You look at chemistry and you have a 3, it's like a 15% probability. It's not until you get to like 4.5 to like you're on the very end of the STEM identity scale that you may have the likelihood of you pursuing a degree in chemistry suddenly becomes more possible and more likely. And we wondered, of course, why that would be so. Is it something about chemistry as opposed to biology? Or is it something about the way we conceptualize STEM identity or who a STEM person is? And that's what's led to our kind of breaking apart and opening up this box we call STEM identity. And what is it that we're really measuring? What is it that our students, when we ask them, do you see yourself as a STEM person? Who is that STEM person that they're imagining and that they're comparing themselves to? A lot of the work that happens in this field, as you all know, I'm preaching to the choir, happens in college settings with college students and academic ways of thinking about STEM, academic ways of engaging in STEM. And they don't account for ways that people engage in STEM and science outside of academic contexts. And so what we like to do when we work with families, when we work with college students, is we try not to define for them what it means to be a STEM person. We don't even define the acronym STEM. We just let them do the talking, let them do the explaining. And as they are talking and through their discourses and the language that they're using, we begin to get a sense of like, who is that STEM person that they're characterizing? And the most interesting piece to us is always when people are talking about their childhood experiences and these conversations that they're having with families and how those contribute to STEM identity development. Our work spans all sorts of individuals that are involved in that, caregivers and children and college students. We do interviews, surveys, videos. There are cross-sectional longitudinal studies. At times we have multi-method studies, all sorts of really cool, fun things. Partly because I get bored. And so I feel like I need to like do multiple things to not be bored, but in general, we see the same thing recurring. This recurring pattern, home support and family interaction contribute to those factors that shape how we see ourselves in relation to STEM fields and STEM disciplines. I love this quote from one of our college student participants. She was a biological sciences major. And I want you to pay attention to the way that she talks about her mom and what she's telling us. So we had asked her about her persistence in a STEM field and how she was able to overcome challenges that she faced. She recalls this experience where she remembered her swim coach saying that Black girls can't swim. And she goes on to say, my mom, that was like her motto. You can show them better than you can tell them. So when I told her that my swim coach said that Black girls can't swim and my mom cannot swim, she would take me to a pool and she'll stand outside the pool and she'll watch videos about how to swim properly and she'll be like, fix your stroke. Or I was telling her this boy said that women don't do this, or pretty girls don't do that. And she's like, okay, you were told there's a girls coding, join it. And she's like, just prove them wrong. And here's my favorite part. She goes on to say, I was always told to love myself, love my culture, but prove to them that we're not what they think. And I just think that's just so beautifully said. And I can feel the passion in this quote and her statement. And she talks about, she draws on these experiences and interactions that she has with her mom, which, by the way, we're not in necessarily a STEM related context, but she draws on those experiences and those conversations and those interactions to buttress, to support, to reinforce her STEM identity and her persistence in the face of these microaggressions and overt aggressions that she's facing in these contexts. So we decided we want to know what's going on, what's happening. Can we figure out, or at least to some extent define the mechanisms that parents are engaging in or enacting to shape and guide, direct, whether conscious or unconscious, their children's developing STEM identity. And we decided that to do so, we may want to do a family case study where we actually would speak to caregivers and children, observe them, watch them interact. Just as a bit of background, part of it is to advance our understanding of STEM identity development. But part of the reason why we think this is valuable work is also because we feel if we can capture those factors that parents are taking advantage of to guide and direct children's STEM identity development, then we may be able to build on parents' efforts, leverage their efforts to support that work, to find a way to kind of align with the way that parents are doing this work and leave long-term impact on children's understanding of STEM fields and of understanding of themselves in relation to those fields. We blend 3 theoretical frameworks when we think about this. I won't spend a long time with this. But we think about STEM identity from the perspective of social identity theory, which the gist of it is that we form a sense of who's in an in-group and who's in an out-group through social interactions. And so our social interactions give, not only help us develop the sense of the in-group or out-group, but also our position in any one of those two. We also draw on discourse theory from multiple schools, including Foucault, in order to attend to the language that people are using to position themselves in relation to STEM. And we also draw on schema theory, and I'll spend a little bit of time on schema theory. I like the idea and the concept of schema theory because of it's in a sense to me intuitive, in the sense that we don't know something till we know something. And so as we experience the world, as we experience contexts where things are labeled as STEM or as science related, we begin to start gathering that information, looking for patterns in all of that information that we're encountering to develop these simpler interconnected pieces of information that form a schema. Perhaps the most obvious way to get a sense of somebody's schema around what a STEM person is or a scientist is are the draw scientist activities. And if you ask anybody, go ahead and draw a scientist, you'll get a very quickly, you'll get a sense of what are the pieces of the schema that they have put together to conceptualize their understanding of who is a scientist. And you often do get the Einstein-looking kind of characters with the lab coat and the goggles and the crazy hair. But then you also get, especially in more recent studies, you get a lot more diversity. You also get scientists that are not just working alone, but are in social setting. And so it's nice to see those changes in trends in the draw scientist activities. And again, so these schemas we form based on how we encounter STEM and science in our everyday lives. And we also form our schemas based on the social discourses that we're engaging in, the conversations that we're having with our peers, our teachers, and our caregivers. And these schemas aren't just conceptual understanding, or we're not necessarily consciously aware of what these schemas are. They're often associated with more of an emotional understanding of who is a scientist. And this is a little bit of an aside, and I hope my wife doesn't get upset that I share this, but every time I talk about this connection between our schema and our emotions, I remember something that my wife likes to quote at me all the time. You could probably imagine the context. And I know she's quoting Maya Angelou, but it doesn't feel inspirational. She says, Remy, people won't always remember what you say, but they'll remember how you make them feel. And I'm like, okay, I get what you're saying. So hopefully she doesn't get too upset that I shared that story. But in many cases, it is these emotional factors that really drive people's behaviors, and they're associated with the schemas. If you ask anybody who's had a really bad or a really good experience in a science classroom or a math classroom, you know that they remembered that for years and will never forget it. They'll remember how that teacher made them feel, whether it was good or not so good. And our schemas and in line with our emotion, they begin to shape our fundamental beliefs about what it means to participate in science or to become a scientist. And then those beliefs in turn shape our own understanding of ourselves in relation to them. So these are kind of like the fundamental frameworks that we're using to interpret and think about our data. And in the cases of the family case studies, we're looking at children and caregivers. We did multiple interviews. We did video observations of the families doing science activities and doing activities that were not necessarily labeled as science. And I'll talk today, just to be brief, about the experiences or a few of the conversations we had with Mafe, who was 12 years old. She was our only child, that we think kind of highlight some of the things that we are learning. And I really would love your perspective on some of that. But the three families that included Chiqui's and her mom. Chiqui's younger brother, to her chagrin, would join almost all of the conversations that we had. AJ, who was 8 years old, his mom and dad were present in nearly all of the interviews, and his younger brother was sometimes present. And then Mafe. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Mafe. She was 12 years old, born from 7th to 8th grade. We had these interviews over the course of about 3 months. They started at the end of the school year, her 7th grade school year, went into the summer, she was getting ready for 8th grade. And if you asked her, what do you want to be when you grow up? She would say, I want to be a herpetologist, a singer, a dancer, an actress, and a businesswoman. And she meant it, like all of them, in exactly the same level of, intensity. And she was just that kind of child that she's in the room, she's magnetic, she's charismatic, she's also very polite, very respectful, and would stop to listen to what you had to say and would respond with a thoughtful response. But if she had an opinion, she would definitely let you mention her opinion. Just a wonderful child to interact with. And she says this in her very first interview. She says it with a lot of confidence and bravado. She says, I'm really into reptiles. My favorite type of animal, I would say either a snake or a bearded dragon. I really like reptiles. I love science. It's my second favorite subject. I think that was behind acting. It's just really cool to me, she says. And also I want to become a herpetologist. Super cool. Mafe's mom was present in almost all of the conversations. Sometimes we would ask one of them to leave the room just to chat one-on-one, but they were generally together in the conversations that we had, and we held these conversations over Zoom. In listening and going over the interviews that we would have with Mafe's mom, we can see and we could tell with based on the language that she used, that she saw a lot of herself in her daughter. She remembered her desire to become a dancer as a child, but because she grew up in a different country where that opportunity was not available to her, she couldn't pursue that career. She ended up studying accounting at the university, and she did not have a great experience with her professors. And she developed this sense of academics, including scientists, as having these very kind of like rigid ways of being. She conveyed a sense of having schemas of scientists as studious and focused and really committed to, like, just very one-track minded in terms of their commitment to research. And she saw entrepreneurship as a viable avenue for success in the United States and for success not only for herself, but also for her daughter. What I want to highlight of the many awesome, cool things that I could point out, I just really want to highlight one exchange. I want to highlight this first interview, and then I want to highlight how Mafe began speaking to us at her very last interview. And we didn't see this kind of messaging, or we didn't see herself using this kind of language until this point. She says, when I was younger, by the way, she's referring to like 3 months prior when we had our first conversation. She said, when I was younger, I wanted to be like an animal scientist, a herpetologist to be exact, which is a study of reptiles, or serpentologist, which is a study of snakes. But I also think it's just interesting, the fact that she felt the need to convey that information. It says a lot about her love and passion that she had clearly communicated in all of our interviews. And the interviewer, one of our students, said, I didn't know there was a difference. And she says, I love reptiles and I like snakes, but I wanted to be that, but I feel like that's a very far-fetched dream. And I feel like I wouldn't really accomplish that. This struck us, that she had never conveyed this sentiment prior to this interview. The student begins to ask this question in a couple of different ways to make sure she was understanding, and Mafe's response was generally the same. We had heard similar language used by Mafe's mom previously in the interviews, but it wasn't as clear as how she communicated also in our 5th interview later, after Mafe says this, and it's just one-on-one with us and her mom. Mom says, I see that she's very intelligent, speaking about her daughter, but she doesn't like to study and read and always be researching. And to do herpetology, you need to do a lot, to study a lot and to do research. It's not a dream, like I want to go to the moon. You have to have your feet firmly planted in the ground. But that is what I see and I talk. So we thought, this is interesting. You see this obvious parallel in the language that the mom's using with the term dream, but also the meaning of that language. The sense that becoming a herpetologist is a far-fetched dream. It's like saying you want to go to the moon. That's an impossibility, essentially, is what the mom is conveying. And that mirror of that language, we found it extremely fascinating. In the same interview, Mafi goes on to say, Jennifer Lopez, the celebrity JLo, is a person that I exactly want to be like when I grow up. Because one, she keeps her Hispanic heritage alive. Two, she's an amazing mother. Three, she's a singer / dancer, an actress, and also a businesswoman on top of that. She also has her own fashion company, and does makeup brands, literally exactly what I want to do. This is really cool. So I love this. I love going back and reading this. And then we find this other parallel where Mafi's mom, in conversation one-on-one, brings up Mafi's passion for JLo or seeing JLo as a role model. Her mom says, Mafi talks to me about her admiration for JLo, that she's everything she would want to be. Mafi doesn't really like to sing because she says she doesn't do it well, but yes, she likes to act and dance and everything else. And now she likes business. That JLo is her goal. What I told her, for that, you'll have to know a lot of business. The first thing that you have to know is finance. And here's, when we go back and think about this other phrase that she talks about, being a herpetologist is like a far-fetched dream or going to the moon. We just find this very interesting because she is now using this analogy, her daughter's admiration for JLo and wanting to be like JLo, wanting to be a singer and an actress and a dancer and a businesswoman who owns her own fashion company, which could plausibly, very reasonably be considered a far-fetched dream to have all of those things. Something like wanting to go to the moon. But her mother doesn't position her interests that way in this scenario. Instead, she leverages her daughter's passion for JLo to insert and to kind of encourage her daughter to consider pursuing a career in finance and in business. So in a scenario where she could have easily applied the same language, she chooses not to, and instead to piggyback on her daughter's interests and passion and to encourage her to think about a career in finance. And so that's just one of so many cool things that we found in our interactions. And in piecing all of these things together, we wanted to try to identify some of the mechanisms that parents are using, including some that are represented here in this exchange. And we put together what we're tentatively calling the Family-Centric STEM Identity Development model. And I would love some of your feedback. I'll quickly go through it. I don't know that we'll have time to really get into the details, but I'd love to get some of your ideas, some of your thoughts, some of your pushback, really, how to refine this, how to better think about this, and what perspectives we should use when we're developing this. Here, we're also drawing not just on the family case studies, but we're drawing on all of the work that we've done, all of the findings that we've published. The model centers the caregiver, and we define caregiver in very broad terms. We're thinking including grandparents, non-biological parents, extended family, other adults in children's lives. We recognize that these individuals have shaped in many ways and for many points how children begin to perceive who they are in this world and develop their identities, and that they themselves have been shaped by their experiences. They themselves have schemas of who is a STEM person and who isn't, and what it takes to become one. And we think of the ways that caregivers engage in supporting or in shaping and guiding children's STEM identity is like that of somebody who's curating an experience. We do believe that to for the most part, children have agency and they are agentic in terms of how they perceive themselves. I can tell you that's for sure true for my youngest child, my 4-year-old, since he was little. If he did not want something or didn't like something, he would let you know. He is not like his mom. He is not like his dad. He is his own person. And that's been true since he was very little. But we see that too in our data, that children, although they care about and love their parents and their caregivers, they are their own people. And so we don't necessarily see caregivers as directly shaping children's STEM identity, but rather as guiding, as curating experience so as to point children in certain directions.
Because, caregivers, does that include siblings, particularly older siblings or peers, cousins?
Yeah,
Extended families are integral in many cultures, not
yeah,
necessarily American.
that's a great point. Especially with older siblings, yes, definitely. We do have some studies with siblings that are like near peer, like similar age. But those interactions are different. With the older siblings, it does look more like if it's a parent. That's a great point. Thank you. And so we see caregivers doing two kinds of activities in general. They're creating spaces by inviting and encouraging children to participate and have these certain experiences. And they're defining boundaries by defining the extent to which children engage and providing them with certain kinds of tools as opposed to others. I'll describe a little bit more of what that means. So in creating spaces, caregivers are using language that offer children models of speech or patterns of speech that children then mimic or imitate and draw upon as they are engaging in STEM experiences or participating in some kind of activity. They can use the language that they hear their parents use to explore those spaces and to explore who they are in those spaces. They facilitate the experience, and this is like by either giving them books or pointing them to videos or enrolling them in a summer science camp or a program at school. They affirm children's interest, and the way they do this, oftentimes in our data, is we see that the parents value the effort that their children spend learning about a topic. They value the time that their children spend learning about a topic, and in expressing that in a variety of ways, they are affirming that child's interest and saying, hey, the time and effort that you're spending on this is worthwhile, it's worth an investment. And lastly, and we see this also in our data, we see that parents in their language, they position children in such a way that the children are presented or illustrated as people who enjoy and skillfully engage in STEM-related activities. But not only that, the way that they position children mirrors or reflects the way that the child is speaking about themselves in relation to STEM. And I think that's very important. It's not just that the parent positions the child in a certain way, but also that it mirrors the way the child is beginning to see themselves. In limiting or defining the boundaries of STEM exploration, here I'm really imagining like a photo negative, like a film negative kind of perspective in terms of the four things. There is certainly a parallel, but caregivers limit discourses by restricting language. Some of that, most of that is unconscious and not intentional, or simply because parents have limited language to talk about STEM and STEM activities, and they could only share so much with their children. Sometimes, and in a couple of cases, we have seen where very explicitly parents say, no, it's not like that, it's like this. And then they use language and almost forbid their child to speak about whatever the topic was in that way. We also see that caregivers are very intentional in excluding certain kinds of activities and certain kinds of experiences. I know that's for sure true in my life. My kids have afforded the opportunity to participate in almost anything they want over the summer or whatever it may be. But because I have to drive them, I don't tell them that. I tell them, you can do this or you can do that, and that's it. And so in doing so, I am limiting, very consciously limiting their experiences. In some cases, it's unintentional, or a parent doesn't have the resources or awareness or access to provide those experiences for their child. We also see these negative evaluations of the value of spending time and effort on a particular topic. And then lastly, you see the antithesis of the reflection that we see of children's STEM identities. We see this kind of refracting, where they're positioning their children in contrast to children's self-perceptions in relation to STEM fields. The most obvious illustrative case was definitely the relationship between Mafe and her mom, where between interviews 1 through 4, Mafe's mom had always, from the very beginning, communicated the sense that, yes, her daughter was intelligent, but didn't have the kind of studious character that you need to have to become a herpetologist. And her daughter had no problem saying, that is not true. I do see myself this way. And you see this, the way that Mafe's mom was positioning her between interviews 1 and 4 clashed with the way Mafe was positioning herself. That changes though by interview 5, where there's much more of a reflection and an alignment in their discourses. And we see this as a process that informs itself. So as children change, parents change, and so on. And of course, we don't claim that this explains everything in children's STEM identity developments. Parents have differential roles over the course of a child's life. Children are developing biologically. They are gaining different levels of independence. They are shaped by other adults in their lives. By the time you reach middle school, you have a science teacher who is now a major figure. But we do feel like there's some value to this model. And my hope is to get some feedback from William and get a sense of your thoughts and your perspectives and learn a little bit more about these things. Thank you.
People should feel free to unmute online and ask your question and right here.
So family support structure, a blessing and a curse. I see a lot of curse. Where's the blessing?
Yeah.
Emphasis.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think that's something that we've been thinking about, the language that we're using here to talk about these things. It does present a kind of like this negative perspective, and we've been trying to it's problematic for many reasons. And I'm sure that's part of why we bring it up. Not sure that I have an answer other than that is certainly something that we're thinking about.
Especially looking for interventions
Yeah.
where there was a level of comfort before you were able to discern
That's right.
some of these quote curse
Yeah.
divergent impediments to pursuing.
Yeah. In some of our writing, especially when we're writing about Mafe and her mom's interactions, one thing that I know I actually didn't say earlier, but one thing that we know, and we try to be careful to note it up front, is that Mafe's mom and Mafe, they have a very strong relationship. It's clear Mafe's mom loves her daughter, and whatever she's doing and saying, she understands it from the perspective of a parent that wants the best for her daughter. And so there's nothing in her language or in the way she's expressing it that seems like she's trying to cause harm in any way. And in fact, for all I know, she's right? And that's what her daughter should be doing. But we do want to make sure that comes across when we use the language here. And I think I'm glad that you bring it up because it is something that we're trying to figure out. How do we do that? How do we make sure that we're not positioning parents from this kind of like curse perspective? Yeah. What was your name, by the way? Sorry.
Frank.
Frank. Nice to meet you.
I was a middle child of 5.
Oh.
And I'm less than 5 also, so just the experience is lived. Or being lived, I should say.
Yeah.
I studied discourse theory in college. I wrote my baccalaureate thesis on it, and so this is super interesting. And I wanted to ask specifically about, so I studied it through the lens of like the way that political ideologies legitimate themselves in a specific community. And what I found was that there are these bits of messaging that I ended up naming motifs, that are these images that are super saturated with meaning, that are super aesthetically punchy and easy to spread. And they work the most powerfully in groups that aren't familiar with the issue to which they pertain. Because they're super easily recognizable and they allow somebody to essentially slot themselves into a discursive framework that represents certain systems of power or influence that ideology supports. Do you find that the messaging of parents and or kind of the like draw a scientist image of what STEM is acts in that way to kind of slot children into these systems of belief or influence or power regarding like what does it mean to be a STEM person? And if so, have you considered trying to alter the way that those work or try to introduce new images in policymaking, like getting more diverse environment STEM?
I love that question. I hear a little bit of the influences of people you may have read and the way you worded that. We're maybe not as pessimistic as Foucault in terms of like the way that happens, you know, consciously, but we also recognize that it's also part of what contributes to systems of oppression, are these kind of institutional messaging or what James Paul G might call the secondary discourses. We certainly, however, recognize that these discourses are hard to change. So some of the things that we've been writing, I have actually a paper that's coming up, will be published hopefully soon in the Journal of Research for Science Teaching, where we talk about rather than trying to completely disrupt the messaging that scientists are these elitist intellectuals that have this like high level of knowledge that's so ingrained in society. We can try to be more subversive by redefining what it means to be intelligent. So instead of saying scientists aren't intelligent, we say scientists are intelligent, but being intelligent is not just knowing a bunch of facts. It's being able to problem solve. It's being able to find the proper resources and identify what are the right tools to solve the right problem. And then in doing so, we might be able to kind of like take advantage of the broader discourse and reshape how children think of intelligence, as opposed to reshape how children think of science as one potential strategy.
And if I might just
Yeah.
follow up, how do you do that redefinition?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. A postdoc or a job.
All right.
Yeah.
So we have a question in the chat. Clarice, if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Awesome, thanks. So I'm a Latino scientist and a science educator at Harvard, and I'm working with a Hugsy grad student named Cynthia Liu on a STEM identity project. But as a parent and as someone who
Did I mute?
Made it worse.
I think you need her.
Oh, I went the wrong way.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So I'm Clarice, and I'm a Latina scientist and a science educator at Harvard, and I'm working with a Hugsy grad student named Cynthia Liu on a STEM identity project. But I'm also a parent of a 6-year-old in a public school here in a very rural area. And I've been thinking about hosting a presentation for parents at our elementary school, kind of like very in line with your very inspiring talk about like their role in keeping young people's horizons open. And so I have 2 questions for you. One is, do you have advice for me in kind of approaching parents about this topic? Because I could totally just show them the recording of this talk and they'd be like, oh, dang, like I think that they would get it. But anyway, just like, do you have advice about directly kind of interfacing with parents about this? And then also like, Cynthia and I and others have been reading papers, and one of them was about kind of this deficit idea of like science learning being something that you acquire rather than something that you already, as a young person, are involved in like the process of constantly in your life. Like you're asking questions, you're testing things, you're curious. So so there's 2 questions there. Like, how do you kind of approach that like practice of science being something you already do? And like that deficit piece. And then also like, do you have advice for me to interface directly with parents?
Yeah, to answer your question, I'd actually would love to chat with you and do justice to that answer. So I can share my email with you and maybe we can find time. I don't know how quickly you need an answer to that, but certainly have some ideas. And would love to get your sense of how you think, how those might work for you. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's great. Thanks.
Okay, cool. And then, but yes, the short of it is I do have some ideas that could potentially help. But it would require some back and forth. The answer to, or one of the answers that I might have for your second question, is we think very carefully about how parents are labeling things. And so when an authority figure labels an artifact, an activity, or behavior, that label holds weight and carries forward in the ways that children are beginning to develop their schema, especially when they're beginning to decide, well, what does it mean to participate in science or to be a scientist? It's because somebody has said, hey, this is science. When you ask a kid, what, you show them a beaker, and they immediately think of science, it's because they've seen it in the class that was called science, or it was shown to them by the teacher who's called the science teacher. And so those labels that we give things really matter and are really important. And so I think it is important that, I think you're referring to this idea that children are generally curious and they like to problem solve and learn new information almost innately. And then it's our job, I think, to an extent that we want to develop their sense of scientists as the kind of people who are curious and problem solve, is to label that as science, to label that as scientific activity and scientific practice. We see this a lot in some of the work where there's like cooking and baking that's labeled as scientific practice. And I love that. And when we talk to our participants, whether they're 7 years old or 27 years old, almost all of them associate cooking with science to some extent. And it's just, I think those are experiences that are natural to a lot of people, or that people can understand the link and the connection that brings science to something that's more realistic and less far-fetched. But yeah, labels. Thank you. Yeah.
How the caregiver's own personal STEM identity plays into your framework, right? I saw that from the caregivers you had were accountants, right? Obviously, that involves lots of math. Did those people see themselves as STEM people, and how much did you dive into their personal STEM identity?
Not a lot. Not a lot. We focus primarily on what they shared during the interviews, which if that came about, like I can't recall actually a parent saying anything about their own STEM personhood. I don't know, Heidi, I don't know if you're still on, but Heidi is my colleague, if she remembers that, but we were certainly not intentional about that.
I would be curious about that and how they frame their children's identity,
Yeah.
right? Like, as someone whose mom does not see herself as a science person at all,
Yeah.
right? She didn't know how to support her and talk to me about that in a lot of ways, right? She encouraged it in her, framework of
Yeah.
supporting things, but I don't know that she had the language to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
So seeing how they see themselves, right? And
Well, there are so many factors, I think, involved in that scenario that you bring up. Oh, here's Heidi, she said, didn't talk directly about themselves as STEM people. Well, right, yeah. Thank you so much, Heidi. I knew you could. There's how children envision their moms and dads, at least the children that we to, even the college students. That's just a fascinating topic in it.
Absolutely.
So, we've had scenarios where both parents have computer science degrees from the same institution. Both parents worked at the same company because they were co-owners of the company. Both parents were computer scientists, and their child saw the father as a STEM person, but no. Yeah. And so, you know, this, Heidi would talk about this much more eloquently, and she's, oh, yes. Yeah, oh, she's talking about Aegis mom.
So that was the person I was thinking of, right? The
Yeah.
accountant, I
Yeah.
see AJ's mom.
Yeah.
That person.
There's this, effect of, the factor of being the caregiver. And actually, it's true even if the parent is characterized as man, if the father was considered like the primary caregiver of the home, we see this same effect where children are less likely to see them as a STEM person on account of them being the primary caregiver. We see this association between how people think of a STEM person in contrast to the role of the caregiver.
Is that because their primary function is I'm parent? And I don't know if my parent has some other life. So they don't even consider.
Well,
it
and
as
that's the way our participants describe it. It's like because they're too busy taking care of the kids. It's almost quote, you know, a quotation from one of the participants. They're too busy taking care of the kids, keeping us alive. So at least from their perspective, that's how they see it. Whether or not the parent agrees with that.
Given your location where you, and then let's see, these were national interviews.
No, these were mostly
Local.
people from South Florida.
So there's a cultural component to this too,
Oh,
or?
yeah, I didn't mention, almost, half of the interviews with Mafe were in Spanish. And we would switch back and forth between English and Spanish.
So do you think when you're developing this model, this is more a model for,
Latino families.
or do you think it then, you know, there's been a lot of research obviously in
Yeah.
like, specific to the culture and how parents are reacting. Rita Carl stuff and so I just wondered how you feel this expands to a greater population.
We've been very gentle in our approach to linking culture to anything that we've seen. It's hard to say this is a cultural element of the system. But what we feel more confident talking about are the immigration histories that families share and that our children talk about. And they often parents, and this has actually been true of the parents, whether they're immigrants that arrived here from India or from the Caribbean, where they leverage those histories and their experiences to encourage their children to get an education, a higher education at a college or university, and to study a type of career that will establish something initially where they won't have to be struggling. And they very explicitly link their immigration histories to that. And oftentimes extend careers that are encouraged in relation to that. And so that's where we see the more obvious link to cultural background and experiences.
So I have a quick question of, so Mafe, she was only 12, and I don't know when you talked with her, but clearly she was, you know, being influenced by what her mom was kind of indicating that she should expect and not expect to be able to do. And I wonder if you've been able to talk with her again, and if she's older than 12 now, if she's come back around to still, you know, wanting to be that herpetologist and that passion for, you know, the science and things.
That's such a thoughtful question, Cynthia. Well, we haven't. The short answer to your question is we haven't. Yeah, I think Martin might be almost 14 at this point. I'm not sure. Or close to it. We had an undergraduate research assistant who started out really as a participant in our study, like we interviewed her, and she ended up joining the team. Actually decided she wanted to pursue STEM research and is now at the University of Florida. Super cool. She conveyed to us some experiences that she had as a child, specifically in 5th grade. As she's thinking about, you know, she was hoping that her teacher would recommend her for advanced science. The teacher recommends this boy that she describes as like a nuisance. And she describes her experiences and she remembers that she thought, she's like, well, if he got recommended for advanced science class, surely I will. She expressed that interest, but she was very quiet in class. She was a very good student kind of identity. And her teacher said, I don't think this is for you. She said from that point on, she just lost an interest in academics then. But the family had always been a family that loved talking about science and saw themselves as like math kind of people, both the women and the men in the family. And we see some evidence from her interviews that sustained a level of interest that later on when she got to college and she had some really inspirational STEM teachers, it kind of like sparked that fire again. And she ended up graduating as a STEM. Yeah, absolutely. But it's the idea that family can provide that kind of insulation against some of those experiences. Yeah.
You mentioned your wife, and you remember that your wife said, it's how you feel from what is said rather than from them.
Yeah.
So I'd like to give you a choice. You can either tell us in what context, in what kind of family issue did this comment arise?
Thanks, Phil.
Or alternatively, what kinds of science experiences make kids feel good? And should we turn off the recording?
Oh, I see how it is.
B.
I mean, we've got all that data, so we can figure that out. Gerhard can give us some cool,
Yeah, but does
statistical tools to
anything
figure
jump
that out.
out at you as far as the positive emotions that kids may convey about STEM and what it was related to as a experience?
You know, I can't say with any level of honesty that we looked at those emotional factors in terms of like the relationship between emotion and activity type. So I'm not gonna begin to guess on an answer, but it's certainly a really cool idea. What I've been struggling with, just me personally, is thinking about what framework to use to talk about emotions in relation to STEM identity development. And you know what I've encountered is it's oftentimes the frameworks that are used is what's in research about episodic memories. They use the concept of valence and emotional valence. It seems like too simplistic of a perspective, but it might be the right way to start, which is the idea of like either having positive or negative emotions and leaving it at that, right? So not getting deeper than that in terms of how we describe the emotion. And so I'm thinking about how would I go about a study to examine and get an answer to that. My challenge has been, well, how will I define what emotion is and how will I measure that? Gerhard, you have something to
Fortunately not. But yeah, well, I mean, you could go to the theological literature. Yeah, well, that's that's an idea that is growing in my mind.
Okay.
And we have been trying to study this stuff with questionnaires, never been successful. Like what makes a kid decide to want to be a scientist? And there are two paradigms. One is it's gradual, like they have an initial interest and they take a class, they do something out of school, the interest gets stronger, then they do more of it, but that's a gradual thing. But people talk about decisive events in their lives. And then I decided I wanted to be a scientist.
Yeah.
And so we never got that going in our
Yeah.
question. But the literature that is, I think, important, and that connection hasn't been made, but I think it's the conversion theory in religion. Like they're famous conversions, like Saul to Paul, and people see the light. And so seeing the science light could be similar. So I wonder if that's a way to go to study this. And I think it can only be studied with your methods. They said our, we have not succeeded in that, but does that come up at all that you ask them? Was there one event that you recall that you said, yes, now I want to be a herpetologist.
Yeah.
Now I see the snake and I want to study snakes. I mean, does that occur at all?
There's one interview that comes to mind with a college student who describes this experience she had with a high school science teacher who, I guess, I don't know why, but the teacher had gone around and started saying what profession she thinks every student would be good at in the future. And
Especially a possible PhD student having a brain study.
Which, so the student begins to describe this experience and she says, the teacher came to me, finally got to me and looked at me and said, you would be a great scientist, or you would be an awesome scientist, or something like that. And the way the student was describing, she was describing it as this kind of momentous experience. It's like, this was really like a turning point. However, when you go back and read the transcript of the interview, there were already lots of things that had been occurring that were kind of leading up to that. So I guess where I have my question is like, how much are these experiences that we recollect as like that momentous, life-changing moment really a memory that we turn to reinforce an identity that had been in development for a long time?
Alex.
I feel like if Alex and I were friends, I would understand this a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm not an undertaker today, don't worry. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's okay. It's all right. So I just have a hard time thinking, like, was it actually this moment, or is really like this moment being used as a way to anchor somebody's
Well,
identity?
yeah, I mean, in the theological research, that's actually what it is. They study, like, when do these conversions happen?
Yeah.
And there's usually this initial phase of searching or uncertainty and maybe not knowing what I want to be. And then into that uncertainty or kind of fluid phase of identity development, and then something like this happens and you say, yes, I'm a teacher. And it's, I mean, this is clearly like a recognition aspect, but often it's also an experience thing. You don't know how our old, who worked here, and he told the story all the time. He was young and he saw a hurricane, and then the eye of the hurricane went over him. That's actually a nice California story. He was but he was in New England and he saw this hurricane, and he always said, then I developed an interest in the weather. So he became a meteorologist. That was his start, and he had this. He always pointed out, this is when it started. That's when I decided to be a meteorologist.
Or the surveys that we, the pre-surveys that we do to get ready to do the big surveys, and a lot of the things that we get as individual things are illness. My aunt had this, so I want to go, somebody, you've seen that, or I had surgery in my PT person, and so it's either injuries or illness, and they want to fix that.
And I think that's also see a relationship between that and Phil's question too, because there's certainly a lot of emotion around the memories and those experiences.
I also wanted to share a story about my childhood. I remember in my second year in elementary school, I was before that I feel like I was quite mediocre, like in my math, in my like STEM like courses. But in my second grade, my math teacher, she asked me to join a math competition. It's just a school-wide competition. But I never joined any competition before. And for that competition, I won the second prize. But I didn't know anything, and I even didn't feel I perform well. I just do what I can do in the math test. And the second day, the result came out, and the teacher came into the classroom. I still remember that thing. The teacher came into the classroom and told me that I got the second prize, second prize. So I feel like I still remember that thing, and after that, I feel like I have got kind of recognition that I know that I can do math.
Yeah.
But before that, I didn't feel like I can do that.
That's
By second grade.
Yeah, so I feel.
So we'll do one more question real quick, and then I would say we can move upstairs, have a smell of the pizza, and we can continue the conversation up there, so go ahead.
I mean, do you think that, like, it seems like the identity formation can be like a mix of that like gradual interest in decisive events, and maybe the decisive events are more crucial in people's like self perception, but the main thing is access. And like access to these experiences that allow them to move forward. And I mean, and that is dictated by, you know, the perceptions of the people that are running whatever institution or framework allows access. Whether that be a parent allowing access to a kid's activities, or a professor who is doing an interview for, like, you know, taking on new students or something, allowing access through that way. And so it seems like the formation of STEM identity depends like necessarily on access, and then by person to person on a mixture of gradual interest, decisive events, and the way that those influence someone's self-identity as these STEM person.
I could put that. It's more, I think, you experience science every day. It's a recognition that you are doing science. And it's not necessarily access, it's a recognition that you are observing, analyzing, and digesting. And is that a counter gift that is being supported or not?
I mean, that's
It's a recognition that you're actually doing this, and you want to pursue that.
Yeah.
And what support mechanisms are there? And I wonder if it's like something that's emotive, something that has a groundbreaking like conversion point.
Yeah.
When you intervene to discern that, is it a question of time? It's like you do like all the demographics, and are you leading a discourse to the subject and saying, oh, you know, was this, or do you just ask, what was the most brilliant thing that came to your mind or that you experienced as a scientist? And see what the open response is, and then pursue later.
Yeah.
Because I wonder if it's a question of timing, whether this is, because if you frame the conversation and say, well, we're gonna find out if you have STEM identity, or if you've had experiences. First, you don't know the subject, you don't know their experiences, but the most memorable thing, whether it's a typhoon flying over your head or saving grandma with CPR or something like that, that comes to your head first off. And then do they recognize that or understand that as being a science experience? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So the discourse of inquiring things, you could lead someone down and say, oh, I remember this, I remember that. Versus that one thing that made them, oh. From this point forward, I want to pursue this. And we decide whether it's STEM or not.
I would propose that there's, in addition to what you mentioned, another layer of complexity to this. And like memory scientists were here to tell us how terrible our memory is, how poorly we remember things. And in our, in our interviews and the experiences that we've had, it seems that it really doesn't matter what actually happened. It only matters what the child or the student took away from the experience and how they remember it, and how they remember how they were being recognized. Whether or not that was the, objectively, quote unquote, what occurred. And so we see that humans use memory as a way of narrating their lives and telling their own story. And they'll insert these memories and these experiences as they're constructing who they believe themselves to be. Sometimes those stories change over time because it becomes something else. They're still using the same memories. They're not just reconstructing them to better fit the narrative of who they are at that point. And so it starts becoming very difficult to then find, well, when was the specific point when people's narratives are constantly changing and the way they're talking about these experiences change over time as well.
Okay. Remy, thank you.
Everybody here is welcome to come upstairs. We've got pizza and beverages and we can continue the conversations with Remy there. What a delight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.